So, if you've got a balance of payments current account deficit, how do you deal with the problem? Well, there are four key ways. The first way is what we call expenditure reducing. The other ways, 2, 3 and 4, are essentially expenditure switching, and that will become apparent as we go through the videos. First of all, if you have a deflationary fiscal policy or monetary policy, then this will tend to reduce consumption and therefore tend to reduce the level of imports. But of course it depends on the marginal propensity to import. You need to look at the video on the multiplier to have that explained fully. But it depends on the proportion of income that you spend on imports. So certainly household income will fall if you tighten fiscal policy or monetary policy, and consumption will fall. And of course we know that people love to buy lots of lovely imports. So therefore, when income falls, consumption falls, the level of imports into the country will fall, and therefore that will improve the current account of the balance of payments. Fiscal policy probably has an advantage, because if we pursue monetary policy, one problem that occurs is that if you put the interest rate up to have a deflationary effect on the economy, this will tend to draw in funds, hot flows of money, and it'll tend to increase the value of the pound. That will make exports more expensive, it'll make imports cheaper, and therefore it'll have a counter effect. That effect will be to worsen the balance of payments current account deficit, which is kind of not what we want to do. So it might be better to pursue fiscal policy. And another advantage of both policies is they'll tend to reduce in the level of inflation if you're reducing aggregate demand by tightening fiscal and monetary policy, and therefore this will make our costs lower, make your costs lower, and therefore there'll be more exports because they'll become more price competitive. The problem with any deflationary expenditure reducing policy is it's likely to reduce economic growth to some extent and reduce the standard of living to some extent. So perhaps alternatives are expenditure reducing policies. Now it's worth bearing in mind that they're not substitutes. You can use expenditure reducing and expenditure switching as complementary policies, and not necessarily substitutes. They can work together. So for example, we could also pursue policy of devaluation of the currency. And if we pursue policy of devaluation, of course, it will make export prices fall and import prices rise. And therefore, there'll be more exports and there'll be fewer imports. So that should, again in the short run, both 1 and 2 are short run policies, they will boost the exports, reduce the imports, so it'll have a beneficial effect, and it'll improve the balance of payments current account deficit. But it depends upon the price elasticity of demand, and you need to look at the next video on Marshall-Lerner conditions and the J-curve to look at that a bit further. But for the moment, if we assume that the PED is elastic, then this will tend to happen. A third method is, and of course the problem if you have devaluation, it will reduce your terms of trade and worsen your terms of trade, okay, which effectively means you have to export more to import a certain number of goods. The third method could be direct controls. So basically we're talking about protectionism. You could have capital controls, but we'll not bother with those. So protectionism includes the use of tariffs and quotas. And these again can have a short-term impact and are maybe justified if you're protecting your country against dumping, where goods are being imported below the marginal cost of production in the foreign country. However, the danger of protectionism is, of course, retaliation, and it could result in tariffs increasing in other countries, and it could result in a trade war to some extent. So protectionism is also, of course, against WTO rules if you're in the WTO. So maybe that's not a great policy to use, except in circumstances such as situational dumping. And that leaves us really to our long-term policy, supply-side policies. Okay, these policies could be market policies such as deregulation, privatisation, making the labour market more flexible. And what this will do will be to increase your price competitiveness and increase non-price competitiveness, such as the quality of your good, improve innovation, improve research and development. So these policies here, in the long run, which is the problem, but in the long run eventually that should boost exports and indeed reduce imports, because we're no longer having to buy goods from abroad because we've got products that people want in the UK that are price competitive and of quality. So there'll be fewer imports and more exports. The problem is, of course, that this can take some time to occur, and it's a sort of long-run policy. And a kind of supply-side policy could be a policy of lower real wages, because perhaps if you reduced trade union power and create a more flexible labour market, and particularly this policy might be useful if you've got a fixed exchange rate, such as those countries in the Eurozone, such as Greece, then the only alternative is perhaps to lower wages, and this is sometimes called an internal devaluation. By lowering wages, of course, that will lower unit labour costs, and it will increase your productivity, and therefore it will increase your price competitiveness, perhaps non-price competitiveness, but maybe not. So there'll be more exports and fewer imports. Only little problem there, of course, is you're lowering the standard of living for the workers. So I hope that provides a useful overview of 4 key policies, expenditure reducing and expenditure switching, which you can use to solve a current account deficit. Thank you.